Jackie Wilson was an R&B icon, but his career was completely controlled by the Las Vegas mob. When he asked for his stolen royalties, Mafia enforcers dangled him by his ankles from a high-rise window. Stripped of his wealth and forced to perform under constant threat, he worked relentlessly until he suffered a massive heart attack live on stage. The severe oxygen deprivation destroyed his brain, and the mob made millions off his labor while he spent 9 years in a coma, only to be dumped into an unmarked grave. This is the factual reality of how organized crime liquidated a music legend. During its peak era of expansion, Las Vegas was transforming into the global capital of adult entertainment, a neon-drenched sanctuary constructed and micromanaged entirely by prominent mafia syndicates. These organizations required massive, continuous influxes of capital to construct their hotel empires and launder their illicit revenues. The casino floors were the primary engines of this wealth, but to keep those floors packed with thousands of gamblers willing to lose their assets, the syndicates required an irresistible lure. They found this optimal bait in the explosive, high-yield energy of black R&B and soul musicians. The kinetic output of these artists, the grueling choreography, the vocal strain, the sheer physical exhaustion exerted on stage was uniquely capable of drawing massive, predominantly white audiences into the casinos. However, the syndicate's interest in these musicians was entirely devoid of artistic appreciation. The performers were categorized strictly as biological machinery, heavy equipment leased to keep the roulette wheels spinning. The genius of the mob-controlled music machine lay in its ability to operate publicly under the blinding lights of the Las Vegas Strip while utilizing the brutal, unregulated enforcement tactics of the underworld. This machine was composed of two primary factions working in lethal tandem: the casino bosses who controlled the venues and the mob-tied managers who legally owned the artists. The casino bosses operated their properties as sovereign territories. Within the walls of these resorts, they established and enforced their own localized laws, entirely insulated from conventional police interference. Their methodology for maximizing the extraction of labor from black artists relied on the rigid enforcement of extreme racial segregation and psychological degradation. The structural design of the exploitation was built on a sickening duality. For 90 minutes on the casino stage, an artist like Jackie Wilson was presented as a deity, a mesmerizing force commanding the absolute attention and financial investment of the wealthiest patrons. The physical exertion required to maintain this illusion was staggering, pushing the human cardiovascular system to its absolute limits night after night. Yet the exact second the stage lights cut to black and the applause peaked, the performer's status was instantly revoked, reducing them from a revenue-generating idol to a subhuman entity. The casino architecture physically enforced this degradation. Despite bringing millions of dollars into the venue, these artists were strictly prohibited from utilizing the main lobbies, the guest elevators, or the dining facilities. While still dripping with sweat and physically depleted from their performances, they were forced to navigate the labyrinthine service corridors of the hotels. They were routinely funneled into the same freight elevators used to transport industrial garbage and dirty linens. They were restricted to using segregated, heavily monitored restrooms, and were frequently relegated to sleeping in substandard, dilapidated boarding houses, located far away from the luxurious suites they were actively funding. This systemic humiliation was not merely a byproduct of societal racism. It was a deliberate, calculated mechanism of psychological control engineered by the casino bosses. By constantly reinforcing the artist's fundamental lack of basic human rights offstage, the syndicates systematically dismantled their self-worth and psychological autonomy. An individual who is forced to enter through the garbage dock after earning their employer a fortune is an individual being conditioned to accept extreme financial and physical abuse. It was a process of mental softening, preparing the asset for the total financial stripping executed by their management. While the casino bosses controlled the physical environment, the mob-tied managers controlled the legal and financial existence of the artist. Men acting as representatives for the Genovese, Colombo, and other crime families infiltrated talent agencies and record labels, presenting themselves as the aggressive representation these young, predominantly impoverished artists desperately needed to navigate the industry. In reality, these managers were architects of financial captivity. Their primary weapon was the contract, which they utilized with the same devastating efficiency as a firearm. The standard operating procedure for these mob-tied handlers involved coercing or deceiving the artist into signing over 100% of their publishing rights, master recordings, and intellectual property. The artist effectively signed away their economic citizenship. Once the legal framework of ownership was established, the absolute seizure of capital commenced. The managers acted as impenetrable barriers between the artist and their generated wealth. All performance fees, record royalties, and casino payouts were routed directly into syndicate-controlled accounts. The artists were never permitted to view the actual accounting ledgers. Instead, the handlers distributed meager, heavily taxed allowances, dispensing fractional payouts that kept the performers entirely dependent on the organization for basic survival. When the inevitable occurred, when the physical toll of the grueling performance schedules mounted and the artist finally demanded their rightful compensation, the management apparatus immediately pivoted from legal deception to explicit physical violence. The infrastructure of the underworld allowed for immediate lethal enforcement without legal consequence. Disputes over missing millions were settled by pressing the barrels of loaded handguns against the temples of the performers. If direct threats to the artist proved insufficient to guarantee compliance, the handlers systematically expanded the perimeter of violence, issuing detailed threats regarding the safety and physical integrity of the artist's immediate family members, effectively holding their loved ones as collateral against the artist's continued labor. The physical violence exerted upon Jackie Wilson was merely the blunt instrument used to enforce a far more sophisticated and devastating form of subjugation, the weaponization of contract law. To understand how an artist could generate tens of millions of dollars in liquid revenue and yet possess absolutely zero financial autonomy, one must conduct a forensic examination of the paperwork that bound him. The extraction of Wilson's wealth did not happen by accident, nor was it the result of mere financial mismanagement. It was a calculated systemic stripping of assets, engineered by Nat Tarnopol and the organized crime syndicates he represented. The foundation of this economic enslavement was a single legal document, a blanket power of attorney. By coercing Wilson into signing this document, Tarnopol legally neutralized the singer as an independent economic entity. The power of attorney was not a standard managerial agreement. It was an unconditional surrender of identity. It granted Tarnopol the absolute unilateral authority to sign binding contracts on Wilson's behalf, endorse and deposit checks generated by Wilson's labor, negotiate performance fees with casino bosses, and control the entirety of his intellectual property. Wilson was no longer a participant in his own career. On paper, he was legally indistinguishable from a piece of heavy machinery owned and operated by the Colombo crime family. With the legal architecture of ownership firmly established, the management apparatus initiated the absolute seizure of his revenue streams. The most lucrative of these streams was publishing rights. In the mid-20th century music industry, the true generational wealth was not found in stage performances, but in the ownership of the underlying musical compositions. Tarnopol and his associates executed a ruthless maneuver. They stripped Wilson of 100% of his publishing rights. Every time a Jackie Wilson record was pressed, sold, or broadcast over the radio, the mechanical and performance royalties bypassed the artist completely. The capital flowed directly into corporate holding companies entirely controlled by the syndicate. The men who wrote the contracts owned the music. The man who bled on the microphone owned nothing. To mask this colossal financial hemorrhage from any external scrutiny, the management utilized a predatory accounting mechanism known as double contracting. This system involved the creation and maintenance of parallel financial ledgers. One set of books, the actual highly lucrative ledger, documented the massive influx of cash generated from global record sales and sold-out casino residencies. This ledger was strictly classified, accessible only to Tarnopol and high-ranking syndicate members. The second set of books was the fabricated ledger presented to Wilson whenever he demanded an accounting of his finances. These doctored documents were meticulously engineered to show the artist operating at a perpetual deficit. The syndicate charged Wilson for every conceivable expense associated with his own exploitation. The costs of recording sessions, studio musicians, promotional campaigns, touring logistics, and even the heavily inflated salaries of his mob-appointed handlers were all violently deducted from his fractional royalty rate. When Wilson looked at the paperwork his management provided, he did not see a man generating millions of dollars. He saw a man buried under an avalanche of fabricated corporate debt. This was a deliberate psychological operation. An asset that believes it is in debt is an asset that will continue to labor without demanding capital. Despite serving as the primary engine for this massive wealth-generating machine, Wilson was subjected to a humiliating system of financial rationing. He was strictly denied access to his own gross revenue. Instead, he was placed on a restrictive allowance, forcing a global icon to adopt the posture of a beggar. When Wilson required capital for fundamental living expenses, medical bills, or basic purchases, he was forced to submit requests to Tarnopol for advances. This terminology was a legal fiction designed to deepen his subjugation. An advance is effectively a loan issued against an artist's future earnings. By forcing Wilson to live off advances, Tarnopol positioned the syndicate as the sole creditor. Wilson was forced to borrow his own money, effectively paying exorbitant hidden interest rates to the men who were actively stealing his primary income. The psychological degradation of this process was profound. The man who commanded the adoration of thousands of paying customers every night had to endure the indignity of pleading with mob enforcers for the pocket change required to buy a suit or feed his family. However, the most lethal financial mechanism deployed against Jackie Wilson, the maneuver that permanently sealed his fate and transformed him into an indentured servant, was the deliberate weaponization of the Internal Revenue Service, IRS. The syndicate understood that private debt could be disputed, but federal debt was an inescapable vice. In the tax year of 1961, Jackie Wilson's labor generated an officially declared income of over $260,000. In an era where the median annual wage for an American worker hovered around $5,000, this was an astronomical sum. Yet, Tarnopol, who possessed total control over the disbursement of Wilson's capital via the power of attorney, deliberately and systematically failed to remit the required tax payments to the federal government. He diverted the funds that should have satisfied the IRS directly into the syndicate's operational accounts. The fallout was catastrophic and mathematically inevitable. The IRS initiated a massive audit and subsequent enforcement action against the only entity legally responsible for the unpaid taxes, Jackie Wilson. The federal government assessed a crippling tax liability against the singer, inflating the debt with severe penalties and compound interest until it approached $300,000. Wilson, who had been living on a heavily restricted allowance and possessed zero liquid capital, was instantly crushed by the weight of the federal levy. To liquidate this newly manufactured debt, the IRS aggressively seized Wilson's tangible assets. The most devastating blow was the federal auction of his family residence in Detroit. The home, which stood as the only physical proof of his grueling labor, was ripped away, leaving his family vulnerable and exposed. This was not an administrative oversight or a standard case of financial negligence by his management. It was a highly calculated predatory strike. By allowing the IRS to obliterate Wilson's assets and brand him with a massive unpayable tax lien, Tarnopol effectively chained his artist to the casino stages. A heavily indebted asset cannot negotiate contract terms, cannot afford to hire independent legal counsel to audit the management's ledgers, and cannot refuse grueling performance schedules. The IRS debt functioned as an invisible, inescapable leash. Wilson was trapped in a perfect closed loop of capital extraction. To pay off the federal government, he had to accept every casino residency, every one-night club date, and every exhausting tour that Tarnopol dictated. Yet the revenue generated from those very performances was instantly intercepted by the same management structure that had engineered the debt in the first place, ensuring that the principal balance remained perpetually insurmountable. The machine had successfully engineered a scenario where Jackie Wilson was forced to sprint on a treadmill that powered a mob-controlled generator, knowing that if he ever stopped running, the federal government would strip him of whatever microscopic fragments of his life remained. With the financial trap permanently secured and the federal government acting as an unwitting enforcer for the syndicate, the management's focus shifted entirely to the physical extraction of the asset's labor. The contracts and tax liens were merely the theoretical framework of his captivity. The actual visceral reality of Jackie Wilson's subjugation was written directly onto his anatomy. The human body, however, possesses strict biological limits, and when a machine is operated at maximum capacity without maintenance, catastrophic failure is inevitable. For Wilson, the physical deterioration began not with exhaustion, but with massive ballistic trauma, an event that the mob-tied management immediately weaponized for profit. In February 1961, the biological machinery was severely compromised. Inside his Manhattan apartment, Wilson was shot at close range by Juanita Jones, a woman with whom he had a volatile entanglement. The bullet tore directly through his lower abdomen, causing catastrophic internal hemorrhaging and inflicting irreparable damage to his left kidney. Emergency surgeons were forced to perform a nephrectomy, removing the shattered organ entirely to prevent fatal blood loss. The projectile then traveled through his internal structure and embedded itself deep within his lower back, millimeters from his spinal cord. Due to the extreme neurological risk of paralysis, doctors determined the lead fragment could not be safely extracted. Wilson would have to carry this foreign object against his spine for the remainder of his life. Under any standard medical or managerial protocol, an artist suffering from a missing organ, severe abdominal trauma, and a bullet lodged against their central nervous system would be placed on an indefinite, fully funded medical leave. But Nat Tarnopol and the Colombo Syndicate did not view Wilson as a patient. They viewed him as an active revenue stream experiencing a temporary halt in production. Their immediate response was not to secure his health, but to hijack the narrative. Before Wilson had even stabilized in the intensive care unit, his management apparatus initiated a massive, calculated public relations campaign. They intercepted police reports and fed fabricated stories to the press, completely erasing the domestic nature of the shooting. Instead, Tarnopol's network distributed a heavily sanitized heroic fiction. Jackie Wilson had been attacked by a crazed, obsessed fan and had bravely taken a bullet while attempting to protect others in the vicinity. The syndicate instantly monetized his near-fatal hemorrhage. The fabricated story triggered a surge of public sympathy, driving a massive spike in record sales. The blood spilled on the floor of his apartment was immediately converted into liquid capital, routed straight into the syndicate's holding accounts. More devastating than the PR spin was the accelerated return to the stage. The IRS debt and the syndicate's demand for continuous cash flow did not pause for surgical recovery. Weeks after having an organ removed from his body, Wilson was forced back onto the casino floors and the grueling Chitlin circuit. His signature performance style, the explosive splits, the rapid-fire spins, the extreme physical contortions, was neurologically and muscularly devastating for a man carrying a bullet against his lumbar spine. Yet, the management mandated that the performances remain at peak intensity. The stage was no longer a platform for musical expression. It was a physical torture chamber where he was forced to violently aggravate his own internal injuries night after night to service a manufactured debt. To ensure compliance and suppress any physical resistance, the syndicate actively utilized the racial architecture of the 1960s entertainment industry to execute a campaign of systemic psychological humiliation. The degradation was not a passive byproduct of the era's segregation. It was a deliberate management tactic designed to break the asset's will. The casino bosses and the mob handlers understood a fundamental psychological principle. If you allow a man who generates millions of dollars to feel like a millionaire, he will eventually demand his money. Therefore, his environment had to constantly reinforce his worthlessness. This duality was executed with terrifying precision. For the duration of his 90-minute set, Wilson was an undisputed deity, surrounded by blinding neon, commanding the adoration of thousands of white patrons who poured fortunes into the casino's coffers to witness his kinetic energy. But the absolute second he stepped off the stage, his status was brutally revoked. Sweating, physically depleted, and often in agonizing pain from his spinal injury, Wilson was strictly forbidden from traversing the carpeted lobbies of the very hotels he was keeping solvent. Security personnel, acting under the direct orders of casino management, corralled him into the concrete service corridors. The absolute pinnacle of this financial and psychological degradation culminated in the St. Louis incident of 1964. The event serves as the ultimate forensic proof of Wilson's total economic captivity. Despite his records continuing to chart globally and his live performances remaining heavily booked, Wilson possessed absolutely zero liquid capital. Every cent was intercepted by Tarnopol's double contracting apparatus. Following a physically exhausting performance at a local club in St. Louis, Wilson was ambushed in his dressing room, not by adoring fans, but by local law enforcement. They were there to execute an active arrest warrant. The charge was a minor civil dispute over a breach of contract regarding a missed performance date. The total debt owed was a mere $2,200. Jackie Wilson, a man who had generated tens of millions of dollars for Brunswick Records and the Vegas syndicates, could not produce $2,200 to keep himself out of handcuffs. When he desperately contacted his management for an emergency wire transfer to satisfy the warrant, the request was either ignored or denied. Faced with the profound public humiliation of being paraded through the club in handcuffs in front of his audience and the press, Wilson was forced to make a desperate physical escape. Still dressed in his sweat-drenched silk performance suit, the man known globally as the Mr. Excitement climbed out of a second-story window of the venue. He dropped into the dark, trash-strewn alleyway below, jarring his surgically compromised spine, and attempted to flee on foot. The escape was futile. He was quickly apprehended by the police, physically subdued, and transported to the local precinct. That night, one of the most prolific and talented vocalists of the 20th century sat locked inside a cold, concrete holding cell. He sat locked inside a cold, concrete holding cell simply because the men who legally owned him refused to release a fraction of a percent of his own money to secure his freedom. The St. Louis arrest was a stark, undeniable demonstration of power. The syndicate had successfully reduced a glow, Bal Icon, to the status of a penniless fugitive, running through alleys to escape a debt that amounted to less than what his managers spent on tailored suits in a single weekend. The human biological engine is not designed for infinite extraction. By the dawn of the 1970s, the physical infrastructure of Jackie Wilson was rapidly deteriorating. He was operating with a surgically altered abdominal cavity, a lead bullet permanently lodged against his central nervous system, and a compounding federal tax debt that mandated a relentless, punishing touring schedule. To force a biologically compromised asset to continue generating high-yield revenue on the casino and club circuits, performing up to 300 nights a year, The management apparatus had to override his natural biological limits. The physical exploitation had reached its maximum threshold. To keep the revenue flowing, the syndicate transitioned to chemical subjugation. Within the mid-20th century entertainment ecosystem, narcotics were not merely recreational indulgences. They were heavily utilized occupational tools. For an artist trapped in a predatory contract, synthetic stimulants functioned as chemical jumper cables. To initiate the explosive, high kinetic performances demanded by the casino bosses, Wilson was systematically introduced to, and eventually became entirely dependent upon, pharmaceutical-grade amphetamines. This was not a private failing. It was a systemic requirement of his employment. The management structure required the asset to project boundless energy, masking the profound physical agony of his spinal injury and the exhaustion of chronic overwork. Amphetamines operate by forcing the brain to release massive, unnatural floods of dopamine and norepinephrine, artificially spiking the heart rate and overriding the body's pain receptors. Under the influence of these chemical agents, Wilson's damaged nervous system was compelled to execute the splits, spins, and vocal gymnastics that the paying audiences expected. However, the physiological cost of this chemical coercion was devastating. The stimulants placed an extreme sustained burden on his cardiovascular system, forcing his heart to pump at dangerously elevated rates for hours on end, night after night. The requirement to perform was only half of the mechanical cycle. Once the stage lights dimmed and the revenue had been secured for the evening, the chemically induced adrenaline spike had to be forcibly suppressed so the asset could rest and repeat the process the following day. To achieve this, Wilson's system was flooded with heavy sedatives, barbiturates, and immense quantities of alcohol. This daily violent physiological whiplash, artificially accelerating the central nervous system to the point of structural failure, only to chemically paralyze it hours later, induced rapid cellular aging and severe neurological degradation. As the chemical dependency deepened, the syndicate achieved total isolation of the asset. A fundamental tactic of organized extortion is the systematic severance of the target's external support networks. The relentless touring schedule, combined with the catastrophic financial instability engineered by Tarnopol and the IRS, triggered the total collapse of Wilson's personal infrastructure. The psychological strain of the debt and the drug dependency eradicated his marriage. His wife, Freda, unable to navigate the destructive orbit of his mob-controlled career, departed with their children. The psychological devastation was compounded by a sequence of profound personal tragedies. In 1970, his 16-year-old son, Jackie Jr., was shot and killed during a violent altercation near the family's Detroit home. For a standard employee, the loss of a child would mandate a total cessation of labor. In the syndicate's financial ledger, grief was an unauthorized disruption of cash flow. Wilson was afforded no adequate time to process the trauma or undergo psychological rehabilitation. The machine demanded output. The management simply increased the touring demands to cover the ever-multiplying debts, effectively forcing Wilson to medicate his psycholo, call trauma, with the very amphetamines and alcohol required to keep him operational on stage. He was entirely isolated within the machinery that was killing him, surrounded only by handlers whose sole directive was capital extraction. By September of 1975, Jackie Wilson was a walking medical emergency. He was 41 years old, but biologically his internal systems had been eroded by decades of forced labor, ballistic trauma, and synthetic chemical abuse. He was booked as a featured performer on Dick Clark's Good Old Rock and Roll Review, a grueling nostalgia tour designed to pack massive venues with older, white demographics. On September 29th, the tour arrived at the Latin Casino in Cherry Hill, New Jersey. The Latin Casino was not a casino in the gambling sense, but rather a massive, sprawling dinner theater with a capacity of over 1,500 patrons. It was a high-volume processing plant for entertainment, demanding rapid turnover and high-energy output from its performers. The environment was physically oppressive. Blinding stage lights, dense cigarette smoke, and the immense pressures of a sold-out room. Wilson took the stage, his body running on chemical fumes and sheer muscle memory, executed the required vocal ranges and grueling physical choreography. He reached the climax of his set, launching into his biggest commercial hit, Lonely Teardrops. He was in the middle of a high-energy vocal run, his body in a state of maximum cardiovascular exertion. At that precise moment, the biological machinery suffered a catastrophic structural failure. The years of amphetamine abuse, the chronic stress of unpayable federal debt, and the relentless physical output culminated in a massive, acute myocardial infarction. The blood supply to the muscular wall of his heart was abruptly and entirely cut off. Ischemia set in instantly. His left ventricle ceased its function as a pump. With his heart abruptly halted, his brain was immediately starved of oxygen. Jackie Wilson. On did not slowly stumble. The cessation of his nervous system was instantaneous. He collapsed backward, his body going completely rigid. The full weight of his frame plummeted toward the floor, and the back of his skull struck the solid wooden stage with immense localized force. What transpired in the immediate seconds following the impact stands as the ultimate, horrifying metaphor for the entire R&B entertainment apparatus of the era. The machinery of exploitation had conditioned the audience so thoroughly that they could no longer distinguish between human suffering and theatrical performance. As Jackie Wilson lay completely motionless on the floorboards, his brain hemorrhaging and his cardiovascular system entirely offline, the 1,500 patrons inside the Latin Casino did not scream in terror or rush to provide medical assistance. They cheered. The audience, including those sitting mere feet away in the front rows, erupted into sustained applause and laughter. They believed the sudden collapse, the violent cranial impact, and the motionless body were a dramatic, choreographed flourish, an intentional act designed solely for their amusement. The patrons had paid for a spectacle, and they consumed his clinical death as the ultimate finale. For several critical, agonizing minutes, as irreversible cerebral hypoxia destroyed the neural pathways of one of the greatest vocalists in American history, the room clapped. The stagehands and musicians, equally desensitized to the extreme physical lengths Wilson went to for a reaction, also failed to intervene immediately. It was only when Cornell Gunter of the Coasters, who was waiting in the wings, realized the catastrophic reality of the situation and rushed the stage, that the applause began to fracture into confusion. Gunter initiated emergency CPR, attempting to force the air into a violently damaged anatomical system. The ambulance was eventually dispatched, and Wilson was loaded onto a stretcher entirely unresponsive. The venue lights were brought up. The crowd was dispersed. The physical asset had finally been depleted of its last viable ounce of energy. The heart attack was not a random medical tragedy. It was the final receipt being cashed. The Las Vegas machine, managed by Tarnopol and the Colombo Syndicate, had run the engine continuously without maintenance until the pistons shattered and the core caught fire. When the ambulance doors finally closed outside the Latin Casino on that September night in 1975, the operational phase of Jackie Wilson's career was officially terminated. The catastrophic myocardial infarction had deprived his brain of oxygen for a critical, extended window. The resulting medical diagnosis was anoxic encephalopathy, severe, irreversible brain damage caused by a total lack of blood flow. The neurological networks that had once dictated the most explosive and perfectly timed choreography in the American entertainment industry were permanently eradicated. The physical asset was not merely broken, it was permanently decommissioned. He was plunged into a persistent vegetative state, transitioning instantly from a high-yield revenue generator to an absolute financial liability. In the corporate architecture of the underworld, a liability is not rehabilitated. It is immediately isolated and liquidated. The reaction of Nat Tarnopol and the Colombo Syndicate management apparatus to Wilson's incapacitation was a masterclass in ruthless corporate severing. There was no hesitation, no transitional period of financial support, and absolutely no assumption of medical responsibility. The exact microsecond the medical consensus confirmed that the biological machinery would never again generate ticket sales, the syndicate activated its abandonment protocols. The legal entity known as Jackie Wilson's management simply evaporated, taking with it every remaining trace of his generated capital. The financial autopsy conducted in the immediate aftermath of his collapse revealed the absolute terrifying perfection of the extortion loop. Despite a 2-decade career defined by relentless, multi-city touring, sold-out casino residencies, and tens of millions of records sold globally, the official estate of Jackie Wilson was entirely insolvent. The double contracting and the fabricated ledger systems had functioned flawlessly. The men who had controlled his power of attorney claimed they owed the comatose singer absolutely nothing. In a final display of staggering audacity, the management structure actually asserted that Wilson had died functionally indebted to them, citing unrecouped operational expenses. The man, who had functioned as the primary economic engine for a vast network of executives, casino operators, and organized crime figures, was officially assessed to have a net worth of less than $10,000. This financial vaporization triggered an immediate crisis of biological survival. Intensive neurological care, feeding tubes, and continuous life support require massive capital. Because Tarnopol had systematically stripped Wilson of his assets and left him buried under the engineered IRS tax liens, there was absolutely no private funding available for his medical maintenance. The global icon was instantly reduced to a ward of the state. He was transferred into a series of underfunded government-assisted nursing facilities, entirely dependent on Medicaid to keep his internal organs functioning. The juxtaposition between his operational life and his decommissioned reality was a brutal testament to the mechanics of his exploitation. For 20 years, his sensory environment was defined by blinding casino spotlights, the deafening roar of thousands of paying customers, and the chemically induced hyperacceleration of amphetamines. Now, he was confined to the sterile, silent, fluorescent-lit corridors of a state care facility in Mount Holly, New Jersey. He was trapped inside a paralyzed shell, unable to speak, move, or process his surroundings, while the men who had stolen his intellectual property continued to collect immense mechanical royalties every time his voice was broadcast on a radio station or a jukebox. The syndicate was still extracting capital from his vocal cords while the state was left to pay for the feeding tube keeping his body alive. This vegetative incarceration lasted for 8 agonizing years. He was functionally a ghost haunting the periphery of an industry he helped build. The major record labels, the casino conglomerates, and the management networks that had profited from his physical destruction offered no institutional support. They had extracted the ore, collapsed the mine, and walked away from the wreckage. As the 1980s commenced, the severe limitations of state-funded medical care accelerated his physical deterioration. The body that had once possessed the stamina to execute 300 high-kinetic shows a year was now ravaged by atrophy, bed sores, and chronic respiratory vulnerability. The biological shutdown reached its final stage in the brutal winter of 1984. The compromised respiratory system failed entirely, giving way to acute pneumonia. On January 21, 1984, the heart that had been worked to the point of rupture 9 years prior finally ceased beating. Jackie Wilson was dead at the age of 49. The industry's ultimate indifference was finalized in the processing of his remains. The estate was entirely bankrupt. The family, having been stripped of their home and assets by the syndicate-engineered IRS debt decades earlier, possessed no capital to secure a standard burial plot or a monument. The man whose physical labor had built mansions for mob bosses and secured the financial stability of major record executives was treated with the logistical indifference of a discarded machine part. His body was transported to Westland, Michigan, and lowered into the frozen dirt of an unmarked grave. There was no headstone, no epitaph, and no fizz. Ico marker to indicate that the earth below contained the remains of a generational architect of American music. The machine had achieved its ultimate objective: total extraction followed by absolute erasure. The destruction of Jackie Wilson provides the definitive forensic blueprint for the systemic exploitation of black artists during the golden era of Las Vegas and the mid-century recording industry. His trajectory exposes a terrifying truth about the nature of the entertainment complex. Unparalleled talent and global fame offer absolutely zero immunity against the predatory mechanics of corporate and criminal subjugation. Wilson was not an anomaly. He was the standard operating procedure, operating at its highest, most visible frequency. His life forces a re-examination of the cultural artifacts we consume. The explosive joy and boundless energy preserved on his records and performance footage are not the sounds of a liberated artist. They are the documented output of a hostage working under the threat of physical violence and total financial ruin. The legacy of Jackie Wilson is a permanent, irrefutable indictment of an economic system that viewed human beings purely as raw material, willing to systematically destroy a man's organs, his family, and his identity to ensure the continuous flow of capital. We are left with a chilling understanding of the architecture of power. The brightest lights of the casino floors were inherently powered by the deepest, most lethal darkness of the underworld, and the applause of the crowd was nothing more than the sound of the machinery consuming its prey. The physical erasure of the asset was intended to be permanent. The syndicate's final maneuver in the long, brutal operation against Jackie Wilson was geographical obscurity. For 3 years following his death in 1984, the burial plot in Westland, Michigan, remained an entirely barren patch of grass. The corporate entities that had constructed high-rises and funded Casino EMP, Iries off his vocal cords, Brunswick Records, the Genovese and Colombo family operational fronts, and the Las Vegas entertainment conglomerates did not allocate a single fraction of a cent for a granite marker. This was not a logistical oversight. It was a calculated systemic silence. To memorialize the man was to invite a forensic audit of his life, and the corporate underworld relies on absolute historical amnesia to protect its ledgers. A headstone requires a name, and a name invites inquiry into how a man who generated tens of millions of dollars was buried on the taxpayer's dime. The machine preferred the dirt. The reclamation of Jackie Wilson's identity did not originate from the corporate boardrooms or the major record labels that continued to profit from his catalog. It was engineered entirely from the ground level of the Black Entertainment Network. The historical record demands a precise correction. It was not billionaire pop stars or industry executives who purchased his dignity. The initiative was spearheaded by a veteran radio broadcaster named Jack the Rapper Gibson. Recognizing the grotesque injustice of the unmarked grave, Gibson bypassed the corporate infrastructure entirely and launched a grassroots campaign among Wilson's surviving peers, working-class musicians, and devoted fans. They collected donations dollar by dollar, effectively taxing themselves to buy back the physical legacy of a man whose wealth had been stolen by organized crime. In 1987, they finally secured the capital to install a proper mausoleum crypt, physically lifting his remains out of the pauper's dirt. This act of communal funding was a profound indictment of the industry. The workers had to finance the burial of their greatest asset because the executives had stripped the estate down to the marrow. However, a marble crypt does not balance a corrupted ledger. The posthumous reality of Jackie Wilson is perhaps the most chilling layer of this anatomical autopsy. Even as his body decomposed, the intellectual property he was coerced into signing away continued to generate massive, untraceable revenue streams. The music industry operates on mechanical royalties, a financial mechanism that does not require a living, breathing organism to produce cash. Every subsequent reissue of his albums, every licensing agreement for film soundtracks, and every radio broadcast pumped liquid capital directly into the accounts of the holding companies that had originally engineered his destruction. Nat Tarnopol and his associates eventually faced federal indictments for mail fraud and tax evasion in the late 1970s, charges directly related to the systemic financial skimming of Brunswick Records artists. But the legal apparatus of the United States proved entirely inadequate in dismantling the core architecture of their extortion. Tarnopol evaded significant prison time, and the millions extracted from Wilson's labor were never repatriated to his surviving family. The American justice system, much like the casino audiences, ultimately permitted the machinery to operate with impunity. This structural failure forces a brutal reevaluation of the cultural artifacts we categorize as classic American entertainment. The golden age of Las Vegas and the mid-century recording industry cannot be viewed through the lens of nostalgia. It must be analyzed as a massive unregulated extraction operation. The men who controlled the venues and contracts operated strictly as resource managers, identifying a highly profitable, legally unprotected demographic, young, exceptionally gifted black artists, and built a pipeline to drain their physical output. The entire ecosystem was dependent on racialized capitalism. The syndicates capitalized on a segregated society that denied Black Americans fundamental legal and economic protections, utilizing that vulnerability to impose contracts that would have been immediately nullified in any legitimate court of law. Jackie Wilson was the jus idui, ultimate test subject for this model. His career provided the operational blueprint for how to legally enslave an artist in the modern era, isolate them through predatory paperwork, bury them under engineered federal tax debt, stimulate their nervous system with synthetic narcotics to maintain production, and physically discard them the moment the biological engine fails. The historical consequence of this operation extends far beyond the perimeter of the music industry. It serves as a permanent case study in the mechanics of absolute corporate power. The destruction of Jackie Wilson exposes the terrifying vulnerability of the individual when confronted by a coordinated sociopathic system that views human life strictly as a depreciating asset. The audience's complicity in this process is the final uncomfortable truth that must be confronted. The thousands of patrons who laughed and applauded as Wilson suffered a massive cerebral hemorrhage on the stage of the Latin Casino were not inherently evil individuals. They were the ultimate product of an entertainment complex that had successfully masked horrific human suffering behind a veneer of sequins and stage lights. They had been conditioned to consume the artist's physical deterioration as a form of leisure. We are left with a permanent, blood-stained receipt. Beyond the kinetic energy captured on vinyl, Jackie Wilson's enduring legacy serves as direct forensic evidence of an economic system operating on human destruction. He is the prime physical evidence of a massacre executed not with firearms in a dark alley, but with fountain pens in high-rise offices and power of attorney documents filed in civil courts. He survived the violent streets of Detroit, only to be slowly, methodically dismantled by men in tailored suits who understood that the most efficient way to kill a man is to legally own him. While the stage went dark for Wilson, the machinery remained perfectly intact, waiting for the next asset to step into the spotlight.